One of the weirdest generalization of pickleball paddles right now is the categorization of control, all court, and power. I strongly believe that control and power are two completely different characteristics, and the current categorization makes them seem mutually exclusive. When people think of power paddle, it's usually affiliated with people that are bangers. They like to hit hard, they avoid the soft game, and then when you have a control paddle, people associate that with soft paddles that is more quote unquote controllable because it just doesn't hit as hard and they can dink around and control the ball. And then you have all court, which is essentially somewhere in the middle. I totally understand why this generalization could have been made. However, one, this describes the person's play style more than the paddle, and two, if power is a metric of how hard a paddle can hit, the opposite would just be the lack of power, not control. Control is how well someone can control their shots. If I can control how hard I hit, then a paddle with lots of power would be more controllable than a paddle that lacks power because I cannot hit it hard. Think of power as the volume of a speaker, and the control is the remote setting of it. If a speaker A can go from 0 to 100, but speaker B can only go from 0 to 50, you could definitely say speaker A is louder, which is quote unquote more powerful, but there's no way to measure how controllable these speakers are without something like a remote. If speaker A and speaker B can go from 0 or max, which one is more controllable? They would be the same, as both could either go no sound or max sound. But let's say the speakers get a new dial that can change by increments of 10. Which one has more control now? Speaker A would become more controllable because you would have settings that B have, but you also have additionally the 60, 70, 80, and 90 and 100 ones. Obviously, paddles aren't speakers, and usually these paddles don't all start at the same base power or peak power. However, the principle still applies. In theory, a paddle with the most control would be a combination of how soft to how hard a paddle can hit, along with the effort scalability. What do I mean by this? So, a lot of reviewers and paddle nerds describe paddles as linear power curves, or some people describe it as exponential. I think it's not exponential, I think it's logarithmic. So, if we look at this graph right here, this portrays different relationships from linear to a stronger logarithmic relationship. And this is just based on the amount of effort someone puts in versus how much power the paddle outputs. So when you have a linear curve, you can imagine as a steady amount of power increases as you put more effort into it, it becomes pretty predictable because it's almost, well, a very simple linear relationship is a one-to-one, while a logarithmic one would be harder to determine because it isn't always the same ratio as you put in more effort into it. A low effort can increase a lot higher for logarithmic than linear, but that growth decreases near the peak where linear grows faster. There are other things that helps a paddle become more controllable, such as spin, grit, dwell, but for now we're strictly talking about the controllability of a paddle that applies for power ranges because these are different factors that I am excluding for now. Now, with all that said, one thing that I would also like to note is that having complete control isn't necessarily a good thing. Having a speaker with 100 settings would be cool, but how often would you need to go to 100? Additionally, do you need to go through every single level? In pickleball, there are only seconds or fractions of seconds to react to shots. Having to think and calibrate for every single one would be too much and overwhelming for some people. It's ultimately impractical, especially when the game has gotten so much faster and the need for touch shots have been decreased and more powerful, accurate, and spinnier shots have been favored. Although a linear power progression is a lot steadier and easier to predict, because most shots are within a range of power needed, some players are more comfortable with the logarithmic power scaling paddle, as it's harder to hit a shot that is too soft and a shot that is too hard. Although normally a linear power progression is a lot steadier and easier to predict, this is not always the case. This really depends on how comfortable people are with certain power level and certain power scaling. So if we take an example where if one person needs to hit it between 40 to 90 for the power, then if we look at a logarithmic relationship, the amount of effort this person would need would be a range of from 10 to 70. While if they're using a linear relationship one, it's a 38 to approximately around 90. So if that's the case, in terms of the range of effort that person can play with, the person with a logarithmic one will have a range of 60 and they will keep the ball in, versus the one with the linear one would have about 52. So therefore, although the linear one is more predictable, the person with the logarithm one can keep the ball in because there's a lot more range of effort that person can play around with and keep the ball in. People should play with a paddle where the range of power is something that they would be most comfortable using in their own game. Some people that can't generate their power would benefit a lot more from a power paddle, especially with a logarithmic relationship, because for them, they might need a lot more just to get the ball over, but at the same time, a lot of the effort that they put in will still stay inside. Versus someone with a lot of power already, maybe they don't need that much power. Thanks for everyone that helped contribute for making this video. I want to have a special shout out to my fiance for designing the artwork and animation for this. Well, particularly the cute ones, because any of the drawings are actually mine.